Well, Sarah Janes, it's a pleasure to welcome you. You're the author of a book named Initiation into Dream Mysteries. And I'd like to say this to those listening. In some of the recent episodes, we've been speaking across topics involving the revolutionary subject, artificial intelligence, political economy, how all these things interrelate. We've spoken about intuition and cosmic drives with Ian McGilchrist. And there's a lot of themes and threads there. And now we're going to be opening up first with a question about dreams and mystery. And for those of you who might have just begun to listen to Voicecraft, maybe in these last few months, that pace change might feel a bit strange. How and why would dreams and mystery be of interest or vital importance from my perspective in considering such things as artificial intelligence and power, how they're affecting our civilization, technology, and all these sorts of things? And I'm not going to make the case to you immediately that they are, although I certainly think they are. The invitation is just to drop in and open up to something a little bit different. And of course, to those of you who have been on this journey for some time, there'll be no surprises whatsoever that we're opening this topic back up. So, Sarah, I want to ask you, first of all, what are dreams? What is your perspective on dreams, and what's been most influential to you in forming your perspective on dreams?
One of the things that has always inspired me is dreams. And, you know, I write about this fact in the book, but I've just always remembered my dreams, always had lucid dreams since a child. Like, I always remember having a really rich and amazing, colourful dream life. And as I've gotten older, I didn't fully appreciate it when I was a teenager. I thought everyone had really colourful, complex, detailed, hyper-realistic dreams. And I work a lot with people in the psychedelic sphere, and descriptions of psychedelic experience sound so similar to some of my dreams sometimes. So I think there's a real spectrum of the kinds of experiences you can have on dreams and the nature of dreams as well. But it's really weird that you should ask that question, because just this morning as I was waking up, I was thinking dreams are sense-making processes. I think they help us make sense of our self in time and space. And I really think that that's why babies spend such a long time in REM, because they're making sense of their experiences, and they're forming a safety net of perception around themselves so that they can operate in space and time. And I think that's why dreams also kind of fade often for people as they get older, because they've made sense of their lives. They've made sense of their relationships. They've made sense. They understand things. And my dreams have changed as I've gotten older as well. And one thing I'm noticing now is, and one thing I keep doing so that I keep having vivid, colourful, interesting dreams, is find new things that I want to make sense about. Like, I'm always doing research. I'm always trying to learn new things. And every now and again, I have these really fantastic dreams, these kind of revelatory dreams where I'm conscious of the fact that I'm making sense of something in the dream space. And they're like epiphanies, you know, and the ancients write a lot about dreams being epiphanies. They're these experiences of suddenly making sense of an issue or a problem that they've been contemplating in their waking reality. Like, suddenly you get that aha eureka moment in a dream. So I think that's making processes ultimately. And you can look at that in a very sort of individualistic, single life personality type way, but you can also look at that as a sort of cosmic, oracular experience. That for me, the cosmos is oracular. The cosmos, the planet, works according to patterns. And if you can make sense of those patterns, you can read the future. And I think that's why the ancients were so preoccupied with dreams being oracular and revealing the future, because I think they actually do, because they help you make sense of the world of yourself, and therefore you're likely to come up with possible futures in dream space.
Yeah, interesting. I think that's a nice place to begin. And then the notion of mystery. I read that in your book, you quoted the etymology, and you'll know the pronunciation better than me, but one of the roots is myin, M-Y-E-I-N, to close, as in the eyes and mouth. And that's a nice beginning to relate to that which is beyond concept. And yet we can, with that word, we can indicate that in some fundamental sense, there is a deep question to this reality. Being with the question of reality is part of what it means, as far as I can understand, to live with vitality. And so how do you relate to the meaning of mystery, and what's the relationship between mystery and dreaming?
I think it's exactly that idea of sense making, and that idea of the dream. You're thinking about lots of stuff intellectually during the day. You're pondering, you're wondering, you're investigating, you're doing research. But in the dream, you have a direct experience of the thing that makes you have this kind of full body feeling sensation. And mystery, to me, that idea of the secret, you mustn't tell anyone the rites of the mysteries, otherwise you're going to be killed, is not just about being secret, as it being like a law and being strict. It's also about the fact that you can't speak of the mysteries because the mysteries can't be spoken of, because unless you're having the direct revelation, you aren't having that mystical experience. So the mystai, the people that took part in the mystery tradition, in the festival, they would be educated. They would be given this information for months before, leading up to this experience in the telesterion, if you're looking at Elefsis, for example. So they were educated. They were taught the right way to live. And it is about being like the best version of yourself. It is about being like a good person, for cultivating a light and free spirit. So you are taught by your mystagogue, you're instructed in the best way to live, and values and philosophical ideas as well. I think that's why the philosophers are the great initiates in some sense, because they think and they ponder, but they also then have this direct encounter with gods and goddesses, this revelation, this moment of epiphany. So the mysteries are similar. The mystai are instructed upon this better way to live, this way of thinking about reality, this way of thinking about life. And then they're primed and they're coached. And when they finally go into the rites, it's this incredibly intense experience, because they've been anticipating this for 6 months. They've been looking forward to this. This has been told that it's going to be a revelation to them. And then in the telesterion, they have a divine encounter, that it's a theurgic rite. They have an actual experience of the divine, and that can't be put into words. So it can't be spoken of. It can't be even seen or really recognized in the ordinary intellectual way. It's something different. So I think that idea of secrecy is metaphysical as well as a sort of protection of the rites, because there's the idea that we don't know anything about what happened, but there were Christians or Christian converts after the mysteries who then kind of did the big reveal and said, oh, this is what actually happened, in an attempt to kind of poo-poo it and expose it for fraud or trickery. But I think that it's interesting, because I was listening. I like your mug, by the way. I was listening to a podcast yesterday, the Schwepp. It's all about the history of the Western esoteric tradition, talking about this idea of ancient people and people these days in some settings are able to know the mechanics behind a trick, but still believe and be affected by its magic. Like, that's magic, you know?
Yeah, that's interesting. So there's a couple things that come up. There's different ways to emphasize the history of the meaning of a word. So taking the word dream, some months ago, I began connecting some of the themes in relation to reading and rereading quite a bit of Peter Kingsley's work. And some of the etymological meanings of dream, you have on the one hand joy, you also have music, then there's also deception and also noise. Now, I'm to some degree picking and choosing, because I'm sure that one could make arguments as to emphasize different flavors of all of that. But I sort of want to bring some of those meanings into the light, because as you speak here to this sense of understanding the trick, while at the same time still being part of the magic in some sense, participating in the magic in some way, that's the first thing that's quite curious, because someone listening to that might be like, well, if it's just a trick, then is it real or what, right? There's a question there.
I think it's like what film, this idea that I did film studies at school, and it's like suspending your disbelief. That's what you need to do in order to enjoy a film. That's why I've always hated DVD extras, because they kind of dispel the magic. They show, when you're going to watch a film, but you suspend your disbelief, and that's how it works its magic on you. And I think it's the same thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, okay. So the next thing I wanted to see if I can bring in, when you're mentioning that on the one hand, the mysteries were named as such as a matter of sort of to protect them, to protect the whole context of it. And then on the other hand, more metaphysically, taking again that etymology in terms of to close the eyes and the mouth. One of the ways I think about two quite foundational philosophical concepts, expression and perception, we could map those fairly straightforwardly, I think, onto the mode of orientation that is invited to take up in relating with mystery as such, right? So rather than it being about a matter of perceiving and then expressing as we might ordinarily think about it, what is it to open up to reception as something distinct? Well,
that's the etymology of alephsis, is place of arrival. So it's where the gods arrive on earth. So it makes sense you're going to meet the gods. And one of the ideas about the preparation that you do in order to meet the gods is to make yourself like a pure, clean, clear vessel to receive them. And this is one of the reasons why I'm also so interested in Egypt. And I think a lot of the ideas in Greece come from Mesopotamia and Egypt, and further afield is the idea in Egypt that the soul exists in the heart rather than the brain. And that in order to receive the gods, you make your heart this clear and clean vessel. And the symbol for the heart, the ib, there's a metaphysical heart, the ib, and the hearty, which is the actual heart, as muscles. But the ib heart, the metaphysical heart, is represented as a pot, as like a beer jar that contains the divine essence of the gods, but also your heart, your soul, rather, your bar and your car, and the various aspects of yourself. And one of the exercises that I like practicing is I do a practice of like dreaming from the ib. So trying to imagine yourself, like these days, we tend to think of ourselves as being in our head, behind our eyes. But how different is it to think that you are coming from the ib. You are emanating out of and perceiving from the ib. And that's one of the things I've been working on a lot recently, is how the language system of ancient Egypt, especially the hieroglyphs, how a pictographic language system affects your perception of culture. And that's one of the things that I think is interesting with regards to AI, is because suddenly we're faced with this very dramatic, obviously culture has been shifting for a long time. But those cultural shifts have been quite relatively slow in comparison with just how rapid and different AI everything is, you know? It's this very obvious sudden notch. And I think it's making people recognize how culture influences perception and ideas about reality in a way that we haven't been faced with this kind of dramatic, fast transformation for a couple of hundred years, since the Industrial Revolution, probably. So it's like overnight, we are recognizing that we now think differently because of AI, because of the internet. The way we think and the way we think is different because of AI and because of the internet. So I think that that's an interesting thing to ponder. And I wonder how it's all going to play out. Well, I think we're probably going to split into kind of Luddites and people that want to go pure analog, which is me and my daughter and a lot, you know, quite a few other people that I know. It's just like, I'm in awe of anything analog these days, because AI to me is just uncanny Valleyville still, you know, it just doesn't feel real. And then people that are basically just living like in WALL-E or in the Matrix and don't ever go outdoors and engage with nature or real things.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you have brought all of that in. That uncanniness is something I think we can also associate with what it's like to witness something attempt to simulate aliveness while actually not being alive. So zombies, for instance, that kind of thing that is often associated with the uncanny. And, you know, a couple of years ago, we held an event, I think it was titled Dreams and Psyche in the Age of Technology or something like that. And it was sort of in response to the initial coming online of the GPTs that were publicly accessible. And it did very much seem that dreaming is one of those elements you could point to as a clear antidote, a clear kind of bastion of response to technology. Technology, at least as understood in terms that we've been speaking about recently in this context, in terms of causation and power, and in this case with artificial intelligence, computation and prediction and induction and all these sorts of things. And the link I want to make, just to stay with some of these themes of, mentioned, you know, earlier, maybe before we started recording, we was talking about the Oracle of the Dead, and of course, traveling or descending to the underworld, being somewhere between a literal and metaphorical way of situating the process of dreaming in the ancient Greek context, certainly the practice of incubation. And in that context, in myth, as well as you've sort of begun to intimate the context of the dream as enabling some possibility of exchange, some receptivity to the divine, there is in there if we're talking about that in the context of the underworld, if we're talking about that in the context mythologically or otherwise of spirits and these sorts of things, there's a sense in which necromancy is relevant to speak about, and how that was understood by the Greeks and how that might be understood now in more modern myths, which I think are still extremely relevant and helpful in pointing to the way in which technology and in general the control and subjugation of human beings can strip relationship of meaning and function to coerce and control and stupefy behavior, this uncanniness, I'm interested in, very esoterically, I guess, for this point in the conversation. But if dreams are something like an antidote or something very distinct from, foundationally distinct from what it is to engage with artificial intelligence, or how artificial intelligence engages in symbolic mediation, then what is it to open to and participate in in a sense, kind of relating with the living history and the ancestors, right? The meaning that colors and enchants and constitutes the sacredness of what we are. Being able to recognize in a sense, the real thing of that, the magic humanity in that, almost. It's so different. It's unbelievably different, and it's a very life-affirming and death-affirming thing in some sense to articulate that direction and articulate that difference, and how to bring these modes into relationship with each other that doesn't just become this sort of Luddite versus like a foundational split in some attritional way, seems to be, well, a really great calling. So I'm trying to weave my way toward animating some of that with what's present in the conversation. So I could ask you many questions, but just want to give some space if you'd like to respond to anything you heard in there or would like to pick up on. Or
I think because dreaming is an expression of consciousness, and our culture dictates the form that our consciousness takes, that the modern cultural trend now is already affecting our consciousness, already affecting our dreams. I don't think that they can ever be separate. I think it feels a bit like, this Pierre Teilhard de Chardin idea of the 0 point, the omega point, this acceleration that we're making towards information as mass, or information as eclipsing individual experience, because our ability to connect, our ability to communicate, our ability to produce information and share information has accelerated so rapidly in the last few years that we're going to reach this, where our consciousness is becoming almost this intellectual sphere, because we're not engaged with the body or the planet or the growing of plants, or it doesn't take very long to do stuff. We used to travel around by foot, then we used to travel around by horses. Now we're traveling around in aeroplanes, and we're getting faster and faster all the time. I'm a big Trekkie, so I think that technology should be used to enhance and expand the human experience rather than becoming a diversion of human consciousness. And I think the issue with technology, with AI and the internet, is its addictive nature, and the amount of useless stuff that's on it, the amount of like AI slop, and that's the real issue. It's not technology itself, it's the misuse of technology. And the people are getting very upset about things like ChatGPT, but ChatGPT, because it's been advising people to commit suicide, or these various things, and people are finding ChatGPT more satisfying than a real human relationship with another human being, and wanting to get married to avatars and whatnot, then it's only as powerful as human beings allow it to be. We're all capable of just turning off computers and going outside and doing whatever we want. So I think you're right. Like the Luddite and the complete living in the matrix thing is a very severe outcome. What we really need to do is learn how to navigate this space so that technology isn't using us. I remember reading something, I think it might have been in, do you know Mark Plotkin? He wrote Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice. Really amazing book. And he now works for the Amazon Conservation Trust. He set the Amazon Conservation Trust up. And he wrote something about one of the people that he was living with, because he was an ethnobotanist, I think. And he went to spend a year in Peru and worked with a shaman. And the shamans would often or the medicine people of the different tribes, if they had visitors stay with them from America or wherever, they would sort of lie to them and not tell them what the plants really did to sort of trick them. But because Mark J. Plotkin was a ethnobotanist and he knew about plants and he knew about the families, after a while, they really trusted him. They shared a lot of information. And I'm sure it was in that book, but it could actually be somewhere else, that they were talking about how, like, if you take a plant, you have to have cultivated your consciousness to have been sort of strong enough so that you are seeing through the eyes of the plant, and the plant isn't using your body for its own means, whatever they may be, whether they're nefarious or good, but that you have that sort of clear clarity to see what's really going on. And I think the addictive nature of tech, the addictive nature of screen is a real issue. And one of the absolute quickest ways to reactivate your dream life, if you ever go through like a dull or a dream drought, is to digital detox. And for many years, phones and screens weren't getting into dreams, but now they're a really common theme in most people's dreams. And I think it's sort of sad. I find it really sad when you see people just properly glued to their devices. And when you see mums and babies with devices, when you think, like, I think that's really sad. Because I'm totally guilty of it as well. I use the internet a lot to promote my retreats and things like that. And it has a weird effect on your perception of time. You can suddenly sort of feel like, oh, where have I been for the last, 15 minutes? How much time has passed? And that children are growing up like glued to these devices and, not sort of mesmerized by nature, like bored by anything other than a device, because the device is so fast and rapid and instantly gratifying. I think that's a real shame. So I think that dreams are already affected by our technology, and a quick way to reactivate dreaming is actually digital detoxing. And some cultural activities are much more conducive to lucid dreaming. So for me, one thing that I'm very passionate about getting people to do when they come on workshops and retreats is going back to like analog creation of information. So writing with a pen and paper, painting, drawing, it just gets you into the right state for dreaming. There's something, I personally think that there's an entanglement in the regions of dreaming and writing and creating. And it has to be done pen to paper. Like when you think about the what do you call it? The fine motor skills used for writing as opposed to texting with your thumbs. It's totally different. You're using totally different areas of the brain. And so I think there's something, and I've noticed myself when you write down a dream with pen on paper, something different happens. It's like you remember in different ways. There's definitely an entanglement, which is why dream interpretation in the ancient world is so interesting to me, because the word play and the shape of words makes a big difference in terms of how you interpret dreams.
Awesome. Yeah. So many threads here. You mentioned hieroglyphs earlier, and there's an awesome paragraph in one of your chapters. I'll just read the first sentence and not the whole thing, and then sort of ask you to take it on. And it begins like this. Sometimes I think of the hieroglyphs as a holographic writing system, and I mean this in the spirit of the Greek meaning of the word holographic, that is, whole writing. Within the nature of every single glyph, there lies an echo of the entire system, such that each glyph really requires a holistic understanding of a living world of signs. I would happily continue reading that paragraph because it's so illuminating. But I think one of the most enchanting perspectives I've heard you share was this one. your articulation of the pictographic and the particular way that the mind, the psyche of the ancients, the ancient Egyptians in this case, was relating with their language, and how they were, well, I don't want to say too much more because I just want to leave the space to you. What do you mean by all of that? Can you share?
Well, the hieroglyphs are something that just continue to fascinate me, and pictorial or pictographic script systems, I think, hold the key to this older perception of the world as being a world that's always speaking to you. So the hieroglyphs in Egyptian are Medu-Neja. And one thing you have to remember as well is that according to Egyptologists, although I don't think all Egyptologists would agree, only 1%, or some Egyptologists, they say only 1% of the population were literate. So they were speaking a language, but only scribes, or only those educated at the House of Life, could actually write the hieroglyphs. And it took 8 years to learn how to write. You know, that's what a skill it was. I mean, it's an incredible skill. So one thing that occurred to me once, because I started, you know, like everyone got their hobbies during lockdown, like sourdough making, banana bread. I got really into learning hieroglyphs. It was like my favorite thing. And I think I also got really into, like, I had reed pens. I lived next to like a national, like, not a national park, not in America, but like a nature reserve. And there's lots of reeds there. And so, you know, using a reed pen and ink and writing on papyrus is really sort of meditative, different process to like modern writing now. So I got really into learning hieroglyphs, and they just entered into my dreams immediately. And so it struck me that, for starters, hieroglyphs are a much more dream sympathetic script, for starters, because you can't help when you start learning hieroglyphs, because hieroglyphs have phonetic values. They are recording a spoken language. And so they have uniliterals, biliterals, triliterals, phonetic complements, phonetic determinatives. It's a structure that obviously lots of people can read and has been read for a long time. But the Egyptian culture went on for 3,000 years. So in that time, the language and the signs used for that language changed considerably. And they didn't just have hieroglyphs, they had hieratic, which is like a priestly script for important documents, a shorthand version of hieroglyphs. And that eventually turned into demotic, which is like, I'm always in awe of anyone who can read demotic, because it's like, it's so indecipherable to me. It looks just like lines and dashes. And then the way that we know how some ancient Egyptian words were pronounced, at least, is from the Coptic, which uses the ancient Egyptian language, or the Egyptian language of the time, with Greek letters. So that's how we've been able to translate hieroglyphs and translate the ancient Egyptian language, and at least make some attempt to speak the words correctly. But one thing that occurred to me, so in Egyptian, the hieroglyph is a Greek word. The Egyptian word for hieroglyphs is Medu-Neja, which means God's words. And one thing that occurred to me is that, as a scribe, because the hieroglyphs are depicting real things of the world, is that every now and again, the world is going to conjure up a configuration of real world things that line up a bit like, playing a not pinball machine. What's the other one called, where you have like the stars all lining up in a row? That slot machine. Every now and again, there's going to be like, suddenly there's a cat, then there's this, then there's that. And it will be like, wow, God just said this. You know, there's a word there. I think that would be amazing. But ultimately, the world is talking to you all the time. And if you look at indigenous populations of Australia, for example, which is one of the oldest cultures in existence, and it's a shame we don't know or understand or learn more or have more widely dispersed knowledge about this system, but because their language is a language of symbols and landforms and the world itself, that's their language. They can read the world. You know, I remember there's a book by an anthropologist. I wrote his name in my book, and I can't remember what it was now, Charles something. He wrote about how he was with tribes in the outback, and they had a story for every single star down to something like the fourth magnitude. So Charles Mountford, I think his name was. And so that complex amount of data is unfathomable, like utterly unfathomable to the average person today. Like, that's extraordinary. So there's a myth for every star down to the fourth magnitude. And that means that those stars and those myths correspond with some sort of activity and action on Earth as well. And one thing that I really love about ancient, and there are modern practitioners of this today as well, is that dot painting of indigenous Australian culture, is that it's rarely one person making some sort of artistic statement. It's a language that a group of people can paint on one canvas, and they're telling a story as they're painting. And if you're well versed in Aboriginal art, you know whether it's a fake or not, because it's either speaking or it isn't speaking. And I love that. I think that's incredible. Like, what a magical amount of information. And this idea as well, like, there was a Greek researcher who lives in Australia that who did a presentation for the Dream Palace Athens event that we organized. And his name is Vasilis Adratas. And I think he's where is he? Somewhere in Western Australia somewhere. And he specializes in indigenous ancient Australian beliefs and ideas, especially around the dreaming. And he gave a talk in Athens about the similarities between the dreamscape of the ancient Greeks and indigenous Australians. And this idea that the world, the cosmos, is this continuum that we're part of, that we are telling the story of the world all the time, every day. And the world is just this unraveling and ever weaving together story that we are part of. And I love that. I think that's amazing. Can't remember what your question was now.
Hey, no, that's perfect. I suppose I was speaking to a number of themes and inviting you to continue with them. The songlines remain an awesome mystery to me, but in part you're referencing them there. And one way that I've, in reading, been introduced to understanding the songlines is through the notion of memory palaces, which I know you speak about as well. So the notion that woven throughout the land and also the cosmos in the sense of stars, there is here a repository of living memory. And on the journey, it's not always, as far as I understand, songlines aren't just about pathways for people, but are also invoked by stories of animals or various happenings of the land. So, but nevertheless, in journeying from one place to another, that the land would invoke the remembering of the story of what was.
I think that's exactly it. Is that this idea, I guess, like, my chief areas of research are how dreaming has been used in ancient times and can still be used now for the purposes of healing and knowing the future. And they both make complete sense to me. Just my own personal experiences. I've had dreams that I've felt I've had some sort of direct spontaneous healing from, and dreams where I've experienced the future. And the way I conceive of reality is that you can, of course, remember the future, because all of the information that you need to know the future is already in existence. And so your brain and your body and your soul in dream space are calibrating the future all the time. We're always working out the future. That's one of the theories about the sort of evolutionary use of dreaming, is that it's so that we can predict the future. And be more safe and continue to live. Because if we weren't working out what the future holds or future threats, potential threats, then we wouldn't survive. So that's one of the sort of basic theories, that dreaming has this evolutionary function to help us practice dangerous situations, to help us make good guesses about what the future holds for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, the notion of prophecy is interesting. So one of the things that frequents Peter Kingsley's writing a lot speak about the iatromantis figures, and he'll name Parmenides and Empedocles as two prime examples of these, where iatromantis refers to sort of, healer and prophet. And he speaks about the god Apollo, and I know that you often invoke Asclepius, who's the son of Apollo, and there's symbology of a serpent there, which I think is quite interesting in relation to this. But one of the ways that Kingsley also speaks about prophecy is in, although he doesn't discount the foretelling of the future, he does emphasize the capacity for deeper attention to the patterns which are. And of course, there's a sense in which those patterns which are present now weave into the future, whether as potential, how we understand potentiality here metaphysically, I think is relevant when we relate to foretellings and what have you, and what is the relationship between choice and fate, and how we find ourselves in participation in these phenomena. Are we playthings of the gods, or can we be in dialogue with the gods, so to speak, right? Is there a possibility for reciprocity in some way there? I've been thinking about that in terms of what is it to enter into a covenant with the divine. And you mentioned purification before in relation to entering mystery rites and what have you. So there's lots to be said for what it would be to open up, to participate in the kind of possibility of receptivity, which then we might articulate after the fact as a kind of foretelling. But I'm very interested in the being on the pulse of the creativity of that. But anyway, just in mentioning prophecy, Kingsley will also reference the bird song, but also the cry or the scream or something like that. And that, that brings altogether a different sort of affect into the process, or into the phenomenon here. I could say some more. One link I'll make, and I want to ask this as a question to you, because I mentioned in the etymology of dream there being this association with noise. One of the ways that Kingsley will articulate the, as told by Parmenides and others, of the descent into the underworld and the opening into the incubation process, in passing through the veil, so to speak, in that liminality, the overcoming of a certain noise, a kind of, let's say, white noise might be a kind of, somewhat of a metaphor. Now, it seems to me the way I would make sense of that is the phenomenality of when one is so sufficiently loosened one's activity of grasping and categorizing, or has that in other ways maybe overwhelmed to the point where symbology, affect, meaning becomes, in a sense, noise, right? The ordinary ways of passing that don't necessarily allow ordinary transmission of signal, but that there's a passing through into another mode in which expressions that are otherwise beyond one's capacity for categorization can actually enter, and one can begin to participate in the field, in the transmission of them. And I'm curious, in your experience of dreaming, and also in the study of the history of the rites of passage and process of incubation, how any of that phenomenology shows up and how one might approach orienting in that. Because it seems to me when it comes to lucid dreaming, as well as what it is to really deepen into orientable participation in profound psychedelic states, there is a kind of mastery of orientation that can be aspired to. Terence McKenna has a quote, it's just coming to mind, it's like, don't give in to astonishment, just comes to mind as one way to point to the phenomenality of how there are these depths and capacities for acuity of relating, which are there to be developed, but that if we don't, it can just seem as though it's all just noise, maybe all just meaningless. And in fact, I kind of actually just want to shut my eyes to it in this other sense and ignore it. So I'm curious what that brings up for you.
I think the concept of prophecy is super interesting. And I've had a lot of dreams with Apollo, actually, who is obviously Asclepius's father and the god of prophecy, healing, music, harmony, truth. And I think the truth is an important part of this. So prophecy, if you think of prophecy as truth, and you think about truth as being the revealing of everything, then you can think of a moment of prophecy as being like an apocalypse, as like a revealing of everything in a moment. And I really believe that that's why Apollo is not just the god of prophecy, but also the god of healing, because an apocalypse, a real true revealing of your place in space and time, is so awe-inspiring and healing and amazing and ecstatic that it has a healing effect on the body. That's how I think Asclepius is sometimes able to heal through dreams alone, because that level of revealing is so transformative. And similarly, how the mystery tradition, when an initiate has an experience of complete divine surrender and encounter, that they can be healed as well. So there's an account from the Telesterion during the Mysteries of Ephesus that a man went in blind and came out and could see. And I can appreciate how that's possible. We know that the placebo effect can work, that some faith healing responses are well documented. And I think that the lucid state, that state of, like you say, between categorizing and trying to make sense of the world, utter surrender and having that divine encounter there, lucid dreaming is the perfect place for that kind of faith healing response to take place. Because not only that, your body also in sleep has certain genes switched on that it wouldn't ordinarily have switched on. It doesn't have switched on during waking consciousness. And those are associated with the processes of homeostasis. So you imagine the entanglement of processes of homeostasis where we're detoxifying, regenerating, repairing cells, and a divine, fully engaged with, utterly believable encounter with a divine being who heals you. So, for example, there's stories of Asclepius, like records of dreams where Asclepius comes to someone, cuts off their head, tips out a load of bees from someone suffering from, paralyzing headaches, sews their head back on. And that person in that dream space, a lucid encounter with the god, really, really is there, really is experiencing that could be just the trigger. And I think of it something like what I've read about dissociative identity disorder, and how in a very traumatic, a very intense event, a child often will split off into different personality to escape the intensity of a traumatic event. And that if someone has developed different personalities, that one personality can even be allergic to something. And if the other personality is brought to the fore, that allergic response dies down. And similarly, the state of lucidity can be so intense, so overwhelming that it wakes you up. And so I think that these events don't necessarily all have to be traumatic in order to have this dissociative identity. They have to just be extremely potent and intense. And dreaming is all about intense, strong emotions and memory entangled. And so I think that I don't understand why people aren't researching dreaming more with regards to memory and with regards to the complexities of memory, because I think there are different memory pathways that are activated with dreaming memory. Because sometimes I have dreams where like I might have forgotten a dream, but in dream space I can remember the dream, but I don't have access to it in waking reality.
Yeah.
And then lucid dreams, when you have a lucid dream, you don't forget them because you're able to remember a lucid dream as well as just waking reality. And then a very intense lucid dream is even more memorable than waking reality sometimes. So, we have calibrated our consciousness to exist on a planet that's rotating at a certain speed. We are like a fine-tuned instrument, and that is all just a kind of accident of existing on this planet. But beyond this planet, there's a much broader, wider, more fantastic cosmos, and our relational experience of that cosmos is different. So I think that's how these different cycles of perception, these different spheres of perception and spheres of time perception, how people have these like altered states is that they're tapping into some different sphere of perception that is hard to express. It's always like, have you ever read Dr. Seuss's Horton Hears a Who? I think it's like that, like Horton is an elephant, and he's got very, very sensitive hearing because obviously he's got massive ears, and he can hear a little mare who lives on a world that exists on a speck of dust on a flower that he picks, and no one else can hear this mare, and the mare weirdly can hear Horton. So he's having to communicate through layers and layers of different kind of time perception. And I always loved that story. I think it's a perfect expression how our perception is tuned to our reality of existence on this planet. And there's a lot more beyond that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a philosopher named Forrest Landry who was on the podcast in the last episode. One of the distinctions he makes is between vision and sight, I believe, where he would articulate sight as to see the actual and vision as the seeing of potential, something like that.
Well, eyesight is what we're able to see visually is a good example of that in terms of how we're fine-tuned to see what we need to see in order to survive, because we know that we don't see it. We only have like we occupy a certain bandwidth of a visible spectrum. So we are seeing a human's eye perspective. And then beyond that, we all have different levels of how good our eyesight is or how vivid the colors might be. Like everything's slightly different. So I think that the world is full of invisible forces that we aren't able to perceive with the human eye and experience. And there's also this cultivation and this development in the Western world, at least, of a hierarchy of the senses, you might say, where vision is up top. What we see is real. And I read a book about, it was about a tribe living in the Amazon, and about how for them, they say they hear something before they say, oh, I saw this, I hear this. Because living in a jungle where you've got a very complex visual field and your occupation is hunting primarily, you need to be able to hear something, because very often you'll hear something before you see it. And so you need to be more kind of finely tuned to your sense of, you need all your senses, but hearing is as valued. And my friend Karen Bester, who is a perfumer who's doing a PhD in the sort of philosophy of our sense of smell, she talked to me about this study where they asked a load of teenagers whether they'd rather give up their sense of smell or their mobile phones. And they said their sense of smell. And smell is so important. And if you look in Egypt, if you look to Egypt, smell is used so often to describe divine encounters. And that's another thing that hints to me that because of the nature of the script, for starters, because of the descriptions of experiences, it seems like the ancient Egyptians and ancient people that perhaps used pictographic scripts had more of a synesthetic experience of the world, because they're talking about tasting and smelling the divine and things like this, which is, you know, different and not really the way that Western people articulate those sorts of ideas. And smell was really important, you know. To smell the blue water lily was to be in the presence of a god, you know. And often divine perfumes are like a way of communing with the divine, which I really love the idea of that.
Yeah. So one of the things which we've circled around a few times, and I'm consistently seeking to articulate the thought which I'm about to give another go, and in some respects I sometimes can say it clearly, and maybe I can write it clearer than that. It's like it's right in front of me on this page, but there's something about bringing it to voice which feels so important, but is also challenging to really be clear, because what's at stake is so, on the one hand, it's so visceral, and on the other hand, so easy to discount. In that very same way, in the example of, I'd rather lose my smell than a phone. What could be more visceral than smell, and yet so easy to discount, apparently, right? And precisely in relationship to the increasingly subjugated relationship we have with technology, even as part of the game of modernity, certainly the culture we live in presently consistently invites, in a way that's not so inviting, us to attempt to use technology to gain our own power, right? So this sense of, well, we might all be in some way increasingly subjugated in this techno-feudal context, but if only you can play the game right, then maybe you can eke out a bit of your own power within that context. But it's a continually narrowing process, it seems, that is emaciating relationship and atrophying our capacity to be present and attendant and belong with the creativity. And saying it like that, you know, all these words, it's again the most visceral thing in the world, but it's even the way that I'm bringing this through now. It's almost as if the very struggle of bringing it to voice is in its own way shining a light on the criticality of the nature of struggle and question to what it is to be on the pulse of creativity, as distinct from just prompting AI to spit you back undead representations of dead symbols, right? So
I don't think it's also about sort of cultivating desire as well. Cultivating desire is like cultivating energy. And I was thinking about this recently because my friend was watching Twin Peaks, and I used to love Twin Peaks when I was a kid. When it first came out, I was like so into it because you could only watch one episode a week and you got so excited in the build up to the second episode. And now everything, obviously not for all people in the world, but certainly in England, in America, in Australia, I'm sure for the most part, you don't have to wait to be satisfied ever anymore, you know, and that's one of the things that the internet has enabled. You don't have to wait for a letter to be sent or to receive something in the post. You can order things on Amazon very quickly. You can eat whenever you want. I watched a really nice BBC archive documentary recently about this group of people in the 70s who went out to see if they could survive in the woods for 2 weeks. And all they talked about and all they were fantasizing about is what delicious food they were going to eat when they got out of the woods. And that anticipation, that excitement, that build up is cultivating desire and energy. It's like, it's like Tantra. With one of the practices in Tantra can be you spend a month lying next to the person that you're going to marry without touching them, and you're building and cultivating energy all the time. And that's been, unless you're really disciplined, that's been stripped out of the modern experience. We don't have to wait a week to watch our favorite TV program anymore. That's why everything feels a bit like meh. And I think that's the most dangerous thing, is everything feeling a bit meh, when it should be, we are living in Eden. We're living in like the most sublime paradise you could possibly imagine. Every moment of it should be bliss, And that's why I think technology should be used for the enhancement of that experience, rather than an alternative to that experience. What a weird concept, that we would rather be looking into a phone than in the world with pulsing life and spirit. I think about living beings and plants and animals as being, I think our role as guardians of this planet is to cultivate as much life and biodiversity and increase the density of spirit in this land as much as we possibly can. And that, to me, is like something that could be really enhanced by technology. And I think, you talked about prediction, and we've talked about oracles quite a lot, and divination, and what AI is doing, what ChatGPT is doing is such a advanced prediction tool, that why aren't we just using it? And why aren't, given how clear and obvious it is that if we just observed history, we'd make much better decisions today, why aren't we just doing that when we have the most powerful tool in the world that could tell us really the minutiae, because it can contain and access so much more information than a single human brain? That's what it should be used for, is like, how do we mediate cultural clashes? How do we communicate with people in their own language? How can we make better decisions about what to invest our government's budget in? Like that kind of stuff. Like, to be still going to war now is absolutely absurd and horrific, when it's never worked. It will never, ever, ever work. And it just perpetuates this ridiculous process of transference of power. And I think it's crazy. Like, we've got the ultimate tool at our disposal that could help mediate conflict, and we're not using it.
Right. Well, we don't know how to trust ourselves, and as we've mentioned in this conversation, the cultivation of receptivity and the cultivation of desire, as you've just articulated, are not capacities or attributes that AI can help you develop. It is not of that. It's not of that essence. It's not of that process. And so the thing is, these alternative ways of seeking knowledge, even seeking experience in relationship with oneself, with others, and beautifully, of course, the other element that I find a real resonance in your work and orientation in life is the, Carl Hayden Smith will use the term contextology to point toward what you and your writing articulate about the various temple complexes and how one might construct to invoke all the senses and the whole experience of entering into the incubation process or going on that journey. The whole context is supporting that capacity for receptivity to actually then enter a different quality of relationship with information, energy, these sorts of things. And so, to just plug AI as a toolkit into business as usual and our already emaciated patterns of relating. One of the connections that philosophers like Nick Land and Mikey Downs will make is the connection. They'll go, but artificial intelligence is capital. So see basically artificial intelligence as the manifestation, as continuation of centuries of process that is already impacting us in tremendous ways. And so, it's a radical cry, even in that sense of prophecy, right? In the sense of noticing that we have a great need for developing these capacities. Carl again will use a language of hyperhumanism, but it's, one can't go hyperhuman on a whim. You can't just decide, oh yeah, I know how to use technology to support what it means to enrich human experience. One has to also live life the old-fashioned way, right? All the mess and risk of it. And it's that risk as well, which I think, and the gray and the shadow, the vitality of shadow, but also the risk associated with shadow that is between us and so many of us anyway, and reconnecting with lineage traditions. You mentioned the Aboriginal Australian context. Wow, from my perspective, the pathways in the social field as it's presently constituted, that are the pathways to travel toward reconnecting or connecting with for the first time that context, are tremendously fraught. And they're also, from my perspective, impinged on by the present culture, which is not of that relational fabric and isn't wise or capable of showing up in the fullness of its humanity to meet the mystery of real relating, and in its own ignorant way is blocking and disabling and perverting what it is to actually go on the authentic journey of seeking that connection, and to not be so utterly overwhelmed at the level of power with respect to what it is to continue on, so there's so much complexity to all of that. But obviously I'm curious for whatever it is you'd like to pick up on, but I wanted to just bring in one or two other things. I mean, I suppose, before we wrap up, and we've got a little bit of time left together still, I really wanted to just ask for how you would articulate the fairly famous phrase, the dying before you die. So I want to leave that there as like a potential thing to weave in, but then also, I want to give some space for you to articulate the invitations you make to people, because Voicecraft has always been very much an invitation to participate. And I know that you run, dream retreats that function to initiate people in some way to some of the practice of lucid dreaming, but also in environments that can be supportive of that. And so, yeah, there's a bit to work with there. I could continue and clarify a question, but I'm curious if there's anything you'd like to sort of just take on.
With regard, I was listening to something about the dying before you die concept, and I guess it is that apocalypsis, that complete reveal that you don't die, but in it your not your senses, but like that naming, compartmentalizing part of yourself dies. It's an opportunity to have a conscious birth. Like when we're born into this world, we are like grasping babies with no idea, like we're completely like new to the world. And so I think it's that opportunity. The death part of it is perhaps less important than the rebirthing part of it. I had a sort of small experience of that just doing Vipassana, for 10 days of silence. where you appreciate how much of the person you think you are is just based on really flimsy, what you say, what you think, looking at people, and that actually you're made up, you're not real, and you can stop and be reborn as a different person anytime you want. It's one of the things that's always fascinated me about actors, and why I think actors are prone to going mad, because they recognize the flexibility of personality and how actually you're not really anyone. You make it up. It's just habits that you perpetuate over a long enough period of time become inflexible. But actually doing 10 days silent retreat is amazing to make you realize that it's all a joke. And I guess that's one of the things as well on my retreats that some people are often surprised about, is they're really silly often and really fun, because I do think that it's sort of ridiculous and amazing and brilliant that we're here. Like, what a joke. But
totally.
and that is a sort of ecstasy. That's like an ecstasy for me often. And when I think about the ecstatic moments in my lucid dreams, they're often ridiculous moments, or like jokes, cosmic jokes, that how absurd and obscene that I, of all people, got to be born and to experience. And then that I can complain about life ever, is hilarious, because it's just miraculous that any of us exist on this planet in space. I think it's amazing. So there's that. And I think that's the kind of death, that death to ego, rather than feeling like you're really going to die. I think a lot of these modern mystery cults use fear as a way to kill the ego in terror. I don't think that's necessary. I think that I wouldn't feel happy doing that. Like, I would feel a bit cruel. And it is also then much more open to corruption, because you get people that like that pervertedly. They get a kick out of it. Whereas I think that you can die in hysterics laughing, which is how I would like to die.
One of the ways, I love that answer. That's a really beautiful answer. There's something of a waking up as a return to awareness of the relationships that give our lives meaning, and that through which we make meaning. Our intimate connections, our friends, family, of course, but also nature, culture, the different habits, right? The different signals, different patterns, all these things. It seems like one way to frame an element of dying before you die as well. In that same way, in fact, that humor, it's often playing with the boundary, playing with the boundary of what we can include while remaining in a process of belonging together. There's a sense in which if we don't belong together, we can't laugh together. All of a sudden, it's a laughing at rather than laughing with. And so humor does seem to function as a way to open up to and integrate in a participatory way more of reality in that regard. And so that is then one way of becoming aware of more of the relations, sometimes the absurdities, but please.
Yeah, I also think that the modern perception or conception of death is different to the ancient conception of death as well, because one of the things that I really love about the kind of mythology surrounding the Encumeterions, the Sanctuary of Asclepius, is this idea that when you went into the place for sacred sleep, the Encumeterion, Hypnos and Thanatos are brothers. So sleep and death are brothers. They're twins, in fact. And so when you went for your sacred sleep, it could serve as a sort of pseudo death. So that sick part of you can die and the healthy part of you can be reborn. And I really do believe that life and death aren't totally separate. I think they're existing as twins all the time, in us all the time. Our cells are dying and being reborn all the time. And so we're in this process of life and death already. It's not like you live and you die. You're always living and dying, always living and dying.
Right.
And when you think about the whole interconnected system of the natural world, that's the process that happens every single year. And that's why the mysteries are celebrating this yearly return of life, this yearly return of abundance, and why people could become so ecstatic about it, because they were much more intertwined, entangled with the natural world. And I notice in myself, like seasonally, you do die a bit every year and you are reborn a bit every springtime, you know? And when you really experience that, you are ecstatic in the spring, because I mean, in England, in Greece, it's such a fantastic relief when spring comes. I'm a summer solstice baby, so I like the warmth and I like the sun. And winter is quite brutal. I find winter brutal. A lot of people try to escape it, but there is also something to be said for going through that cycle with the world every year, which I quite like. But I think that's one of the things also that negates this terror of death, which is kind of our main issue with AI, with the internet, with us constantly presenting ourselves online and being concerned about, oh shit, I look a bit old, or I'm not presentable enough. I think that the guy, is it Brian Johnson, who's got the Don't Die movement?
Yeah.
I don't really get it. It's like death might be amazing. Like death, we might be just living in preparation for a glorious afterlife. Who knows? But I think to be scared of dying, to fear getting old, is dangerous, and you end up not living to your full potential anyway, which is the whole point of dying before you die, is that you, after that moment, you're like, I'm just going to fucking love life and live every moment and enjoy myself and have as much pleasure as possible and be as good to people as I can, because that is increasing ecstasy on earth, which is more important than one person having the semen analysis of a 17-year-old boy, I think. Like Brian Johnson having like every single bodily fluid scanned and screened every single day. Like, it sounds boring as fuck.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't have it, as you say, it's not affirming life. It's just running from death.
I'm quite fascinated with Brian Johnson, though. The one thing he revealed a couple of days ago is that he's had a girlfriend for years, and love is amazing at making you young and healthy and happy. And probably that might be the one thing that's actually working more than all of his other stuff, because if he's really in love, love is a magic. Love is amazing. So yeah, I think that more of that sort of thing, less of being terrified of getting old and dying, and more enjoying yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I would love to speak again. I truly would love to speak again. I hope we can. I'd also love to invite you into dialogue with a few other people. I'm sure we could have a fun dialogue with Carl one day, but also there are some remarkable people in the voicecraft context, both, as collaborators and also members and guests. And I really think that the perspective you bring, it brings a lot of life. It opens up a tangible and imaginal way of connecting to at least the possibility for a more enchanted way of experiencing psyche. And so I'm grateful for the work that you're doing. And if I can, I would love to feel into a final question to ask, hopefully give you as long as you need to respond to that. I think that, we began, you articulated a framing for understanding dreams as sense-making. And, we quickly moved on there to involve more concepts and notions which are not so dry as that term from my perspective. I wonder if you articulated that to begin with because I sort of gave the open that there might be people listening to this who aren't necessarily curious about dreams. I should say that the core of this whole project didn't need that intro at all. But there's one word which was only just mentioned. Okay, so I'm gonna throw two things at you. Two. One, because I mentioned the serpent, and I've heard you speak to the serpent wrapped around Asclepius' rod before, and I'm just curious for your perspective on the symbology of the serpent as far as it shows up in the context of dreaming, healing, and what have you. I can intuit. I've done, quite a bit of work with that symbol. The other term is magic. You mentioned sympathy. I know in the book you'll speak about sympathy as a kind of magic. We won't have, I think about magic again. We've used the language of receptivity and this sort of thing, and we might think in terms of attraction and orientation, constellation, receptivity. There's maybe too much for me to share there for our sort of time remaining. But I'm curious about how do you see the relationship what's the connection between dream mysteries and the notion of magic as you've come to understand that? And then also, how do you relate to the symbology of the serpent?
So magic, I really like the ancient Egyptian term for what is called ancient Egyptian magic, which is Heka. And that combines the symbol of the Ka, which is the creative force, the animating life force of any individual. And He is a symbol of twisted flax, which is relates to the temple flame that was kept alight all the time in ancient Egyptian temples. So it's something like the eternal creative force. And the Egyptians have very magical way of thinking of correspondences or sympathy, if you like. So to give an example of that, the Great Pyramid of Khufu is called the Akhet, Khufu Akhet, the horizon of Khufu. But the horizon has two different ways of being written in ancient Egyptian. There's a horizon hieroglyph, which is Akhet, and that shows two mountains with the sun rising up in between. Or there is the Ak bird, which is a crested ibis, which relates to an effective spirit or becoming a spirit. So the pyramid can be seen because they always use the Ak, a crested ibis sign to write the horizon of Khufu, is a vehicle for the spirit of Khufu to become effective. And probably the tip of the Great Pyramid was gold tipped. But even if it wasn't, the whole pyramid was encased with shining white limestone polished slabs. So that point of the pyramid would have been a point where the first rays of the sun would have hit, or it would have been a point of light. And a point of light being at the acme of the pyramid means that the spirit of Khufu can become a point of light and then can travel in a star back up to the heavens. And so that idea of, it's like divine signatures. If a food or a fruit or a nut or a berry looks like a particular body part, it's probably good for that particular body part. Like a walnut is good for your brain because it looks like a brain. So that's how I see magic. It's like these correspondences, this weaving of meaning, and this echo, these patterned echoes that are telling you and speaking to you, the world speaking to you, basically. which is the ancient Egyptian idea, which is why their language is like that. Because, when you see a word rendered in hieroglyphs, you're making all of these novel associations and these cross associations, because not only do they have phonetic values, so they sound like some other words as well, but every single sign is a real thing that you can't help but make associations with. So that's how I see magic. And I think that dreaming or the dream space is the most potent place to practice and to understand the mechanisms of how thought creates things and how thought forms become real things in the waking world. So that's something I've always been interested in. And then what was the other question that you asked?
The serpent.
Sorry, what was that?
The serpent, the snake.
Oh, yeah. So the serpent. I was thinking about this recently. So I've just come back from Egypt. I led a retreat there at my friend Mervat's retreat center. Mervat's an amazing, incredible, wise woman who is a psychiatrist and a Hermetic philosopher, an Egyptian lady. And she has set up and built from nothing this utterly beautiful retreat center in the middle of Egypt, on top of the ancient sound of city of Hermopolis, which was the cult center of Thoth. So one thing that I really felt when I was last there, that Asclepius relates more closely to Thoth and Imhotep than is usually thought. We know that the Egyptians and the Greeks recognized Asclepius in Imhotep, because Imhotep was the divine physician, like a healing god or demigod. His father is mythologically considered to be Ptah, who's a creator deity, but also he was likened to Thoth. And the ancient Egyptian word for Thoth, in the Old Kingdom at least, included the sign of the serpent and the sign of the twisted flax, which, when you combine those two things, sort of looks similar to the rod of Asclepius. And there are a lot of serpents around Saqqara, which was a really important cult center for Imhotep. And the ancient Egyptian word for Thoth is Jehuti. And so the first letter of Thoth's name is a serpent. And the serpent as a image in a dream in ancient Egyptian dream interpretation often relates to words and utterances. And this is why writing and dream interpretation and interpretation of words is so significant, I think, in dream interpretation, because Thoth is very much a dream deity who appears frequently in people's dreams. And so the serpent's been recognized since Mesopotamian times, if not before, as a healing symbol, because we know that the snake sheds its skin regularly and seems to emerge reborn and rejuvenated. But also, parallel to that is this idea that the serpent represents chaotic forces, as in the case of Apophis, who is the serpent that Ra battles every single night to allow the world or allow the sun to rise again. Like, he has to battle this serpent every night. And then you get a lot of these images in Ptolemaic Egypt of the divine child Horus holding the poisonous serpents and scorpions that bit him or stung him when he was in the swamp and was saved by Isis and Thoth. And so this, a bit like the Potnia Theron images, there's this idea that some god or goddess or divinity can control the chaotic forces of nature. And if you think about it, the rod of Asclepius is a perfect symbol of a chaotic force, not just controlled, but tamed. And Aegea, similarly, is always shown, his daughter, is always shown feeding the serpents out of her bowl or her cup. And we know that some snake venoms were used as medicine in ancient Greece as well. So if a large animal, say a horse, is bitten by a snake, some of that horse's blood contains an antidote, because the snake isn't strong enough to kill a whole horse. So a bit of the horse's blood could be used as medicine, or a small amount of venom could be used as medicine. So we know that that was also the case that venom was used as medicine. But I think that ultimately that symbol of the serpent twined around the rod is about the taming of chaotic forces. When I do my research, I very often do like a dream incubation practice as well. And I was writing a article about encumesis, this particular sacred sleep. And there are loads of different ideas about what makes this sleep at the sanctuary different to a normal kind of sleep. And I have been had been communicating for a while with like a classicist and philologist who has spent like many years living in the Peloponnese. And he was talking about how he thinks that the sacred sleep refers to anesthetized sleep. So it's this totally different experience of sleep that is a drugged sleep, essentially. And I think that that is also true. I think that sometimes we know they were using fumigations of opium. We know from Dioscorides that they were using materia that could anesthetize people. So they were bruising mandrake root in wine, for example, which would have profoundly numbed pain and knocked people out. And so when you look at the Yamata, which are dream narratives, so they tell you about what people experienced when they were actually at the sanctuary. And some of them sound really supernatural and unbelievable and a bit like religious propaganda. And some of them sound like real accounts of operations. And one man writes about how he woke up and he had been pinned down by the therapeutai or the physicians working at the sanctuary and was being cut open, and he fought and struggled and then was restrained again. And then Asclepius came to him, operated upon him, and then he was fine. And that to me seems more like someone waking up mid-operation and being shocked and surprised to discover that he was being pinned down, and then, the operation continued. So we know they were very sophisticated. It wasn't like it was only dreams that worked at the sanctuary. Dreams was one of many things. It was like fully holistic. There's multiple surgical instruments that have been found there. Like they definitely were performing operations. The person I speak to who's a classicist was saying there's even records of a sex change being performed or some sort of operation like pertaining to that. So all sorts of stuff was happening there. But also Asclepius could just heal spontaneously in a dream without you ever visiting a sanctuary. So I think everything can work. I think it isn't a one or the other option. It's like there's a whole palette of experiences to choose from. But the key to the Asclepian as an institution is that it's holistic. It's everything. And I think that one thing I'm really, really passionate and interested and excited about at the moment is how beauty and a beautiful, harmonious environment heals people, actually properly heals people. If they aren't too ill, if you take someone to somewhere that's beautiful and easy and inspiring, people will feel better. It's common sense, but it's weirdly been forgotten about. And I'm in Istanbul at the moment because I find Istanbul to be the most sublime, beautiful place ever. And I feel amazing when I'm here because it just flows. It's really well organized. The transportation system is great, but everywhere is gorgeous and beautiful. And there's this real pride in the beauty of it as well. And this delightful, culture of having rituals for everything, from when you get a cup of Turkish coffee with a piece of Turkish delight and all the ceremony that comes with it. I just adore it. And I was back in England recently and I was walking down our high street in Hastings thinking, this is really ugly. When did England forget about like making places beautiful to elevate the population? Because it really does. It makes people behave better if you have somewhere beautiful. And I love London. I love central London. I spend a lot of time at the British Museum, in Bloomsbury, in Kensington. Those places are fantastic. And it's not fair that only rich people get beauty. I think that everyone should have beauty. And people started to build just, I guess, during the Second World War in England, just out of necessity, very quickly and cheaply. And then that became a bit seductive, that why build something beautiful when we can build something super quick and easy that does the job? But it's killing people. It's like ugliness is killing people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Well said. Maybe we'll bring it to a close there. Yeah. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Tim. Thank you for having me.